So I wanted to, before we get to looking at a very specific case of colonialism during the period of the high imperialism, the period of empire and imperialism during the 1800s, the 19th century, I wanted to show us a few maps to kind of bring it all together with respects to global imperialism and European exploration from the beginnings of Columbus's voyages. So here you see sort of the early age of exploration and imperialism and the seizure of imperial possessions, particularly by the Portuguese and the Spanish. So you see, of course, up here, Portugal and, of course, Spain. You see all in the red would have been areas during the 1500s of Spanish possessions. And, of course, in the lighter sort of turquoise or blue, you see the possessions of the Portuguese. Many of these possessions, of course, in many cases are outposts, as you see here in modern-day Brazil and along the coast of the Horn of, or not the Horn of Africa, the western portion of Africa. Down here, of course, in southern Africa, up here, this is the Horn of Africa, by the way, where Somalia is, and Ethiopia. And, of course, Portuguese ports in India. It's Indonesia. You see the Spanish-held Philippines over here. So these are possessions held by the Portuguese and the Spanish very early on in the age of imperialism, long before the high imperialism of the 1800s. And this was the so-called Treaty of Tordesillas from 1494, in which the Portuguese and the Spanish basically agreed to divide their imperial possessions in the developing world with this line of longitude that basically declared all areas to the west to be Spanish and all areas to the east to be within the domain of the Portuguese. Very early on. So I want to take us back to the beginning. Think about the early age of exploration and imperialism by the Portuguese and the Spanish. By the 1700s, there was a myriad of trading posts in places like Africa and Asia. So, of course, you see here a Portuguese trading post in West Africa. Here, of course, the Dutch trading post in Cape Town, South Africa. That will, during the 19th century, the 1800s, of course, this will become a British colony. Of course, India, you see the myriad of different trading posts here, with English posts here in Madras, Calcutta, Bombay, Portuguese Goa, Portuguese Calcutta, and other sort of colonies here. The Dutch down here in Sri Lanka. Of course, over here in Indonesia, you see a great deal of Dutch trading posts. Indonesia became a Dutch colony, and of course, trading posts here, the Dutch being really the only power allowed to trade during this period with the Japanese in the southern port of Nagasaki, the Spanish here in the Philippines as well. This is Asia and Africa in the 1700s. Now, by the high imperialism of the 19th century, of the 1800s, we see a much more thorough and robust colonization and imperialization of the developing world. And we will be talking about a specific case happening right here, which is the case of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, which will be colonized by the French during the later 1800s, the 19th century. And of course, we know that the robust imperialism of the 1900s, of the 18th century, was driven by new technologies that fueled communication, speed of transportation, as well as military technologies, all fueled that. Now, going back to the roots again, much of the development of European imperialism early on had to do, particularly with the English and the Dutch, the emergence of these two powers as major imperial powers during the 1800s had to do with the development, as a result of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, for example, and Adam Smith, the development of private investment, private credit institutions, banking institutions, which made it possible for the emergence of private trading companies, early corporations like the English East India Company or the Dutch United East India Company, both established at the outset of the 1600s, at the outset of the 17th century. And these were basically large corporations that traveled the world, that established trading ports, that obtained resources, and did so on large privately owned ships, but with a great deal of government support, including military support if needed. These were exceptionally profitable enterprises, and they formed the basis for the roots of a very dominant English and also not insignificant Dutch empire during the 1800s. When we get to the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, the turn of the 20th century, the world is much, much more thoroughly colonized by Western European powers, as well as the emergence of a Japanese imperialism and an American imperialism. By 1900, the United States has the colonies of the Philippines. It also has Hawaii. It also has Puerto Rico, which you cannot really tell on this map here. The United States becomes an early or a late sort of player in the age of imperialism, during the high imperialism driven by those new technologies, military, communication, and transportation technologies. The British Empire, of course, becomes tremendously dominant across Africa in places like Egypt, Libya, today what is North and South Sudan, down into areas of South Africa. Of course, places such as it was known at the time, Rhodesia. Germany had become a late player in imperialism, but also seized territories in Africa. The French, France is right here, of course, become hugely significant in West and Central Africa and in Madagascar. And the French also will, as we will talk about, colonize Indochina, as they called it, Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, to compete largely with the British Empire in India, including areas that are today Pakistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and also Malaysia. This area down here is all a colony of the Dutch. This is the Dutch East Indies. Now, interestingly, even though the purple refers to independent countries, we know this just means these are not places that were made formal colonies. However, major powers can still be imperialist and use imperialism against countries that are not colonies. Here you see China, and by 1900, China was very much being imperialized by Japan, by the British, by the French, by the United States, as well as Germany. So China remained independent, Qing China. However, China was still nonetheless facing the imperial sway of powerful Western European nations, including as well the United States and Japan. The Americas, of course, by this period was independent. However, likewise, these countries in the Americas faced a great deal of imperial sway and influence from the United States, which regarded these areas as, if you will, its own backyard, and carried a great deal of economic and political and military power to influence areas, and most significantly areas in the Caribbean, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti, and Central America and Mexico. And American military forces are sent to these places many times. There were American excursions into military expeditions into Mexico, into Cuba, into the Dominican Republic, into Nicaragua. The United States even encouraged the independence and the revolution in Panama. So these are very much also places facing the imperialism of Western European and American and Japanese powers by the end of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century. We're now going to turn our attention to this place right here. Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, what the French called Indochina.